She had been carrying the wrong man's secrets for 3 years before she ever stood inside the Greystone Keep, and in all that time, the only thing that had kept her alive was a habit so small most people would not have called it a skill. She remembered everything, not in the way scholars remember, with systems and categories and ink-stained fingers arranging facts into rows. She remembered the way water remembers the shape of a vessel, completely, without effort, without choice. Every letter she had ever carried, every seal pressed into wax, every face that had opened a door and taken a package from her hands, every pause before a signature, every moment of hesitation that lasted slightly too long. She had been delivering letters since she was 15, and the year her mother died, and the fever took with it every arrangement that had kept the small house in the lower quarter of Ashenvale functioning as a home rather than a debt. Sonara had not had time to grieve properly. She had had 3 days before the landlord came for his coin, and that urgency had in the end been its own kind of grace. It had left her no space to collapse into. She had gone looking for work the morning after they carried her mother out, and the courier network had taken her on because she was small and still, and moved through the city like someone who had learned very young that the best way to survive a space was to not draw attention to yourself inside it. She was, had she any reason to notice it, striking in a way that was easy to underestimate. The dark auburn hair fell in a thick braid past her shoulder blades, and came loose at the temples the way it always did by midday. She was too often busy to stay still long enough for a braid to hold. Her face had the clean architecture of beauty through precision rather than softness. High cheekbones, a jaw slightly too determined for prettiness, dark eyes that moved over a room the way a scholar moves over a page. She was slender and carried herself with the straightness of someone who had learned to take up exactly as much space as required. In the lower quarter, no one had thought to mention it. There were more urgent things than the appearance of a girl who delivered letters. She had a small leather journal, bought with the first coin she earned, in which she had begun recording her routes. The routes became deliveries, and the deliveries became patterns. The patterns, over 3 years, became something she did not have a word for. A map of the city, drawn not in streets and squares, but in the movement of information between people, a living document of who was communicating with whom, and through which channels and with what frequency. She had not built it as intelligence. She had built it the way some people pressed flowers or collected river stones, because the world was a system, and she wanted to understand it. And understanding it made the uncertainty of living inside it fractionally more bearable. That journal was hidden in a flour barrel in her kitchen when they arrested her. The night they came, there were 4 of them, and they did not knock. The door of her room came off the latch with one shoulder, and she had half a second of candlelight, and then rough hands on both arms, hauling her up before she had fully registered what was happening, her chair clattering back against the wall, and her inkpot going over and spreading black across the floor like a stain that would never fully leave. She did not scream. She had learned when she was very young that screaming in the lower quarter brought no one to your aid and only told your attacker you were afraid. She went still instead and let them move her, and she kept her eyes open. The torches in the lower courtyard of the watch-house burned sideways in the wind off the river. The cobblestones were wet, and her boots had a split in the left sole, and the cold came through it directly. The guard on her right arm gripped too tight. She would bruise across the bicep before morning, and the lieutenant walked ahead without looking back at her, which was its own kind of information. She noticed his cloak was mended at the left shoulder, with thread that did not quite match. She noticed that neither of the guards holding her would look directly at her face, which meant they were uncomfortable with the assignment, which meant someone above their rank had given the order. They were not entirely certain they were doing the right thing. That was useful. She was afraid. She knew this because her breathing had gone shallow, and her hands were cold in a way that had nothing to do with the night air. But fear, she had learned, was information. And the information her fear was giving her now was this: they did not know what she had actually done. They knew only what they had been told to find. The accusation had come from Lady Orveth, wife of Councillor Orveth, who governed the eastern trade routes, from a large stone house at the top of the merchant district, and whose correspondence Sonara had been carrying for 14 months. The sealed letter they had recovered, the one bearing the contents of the Northern Garrison rotation, the one they were calling evidence of espionage against the Crown, had been pressed into her satchel at the market gate 3 months prior by Orveth herself, with the instruction that it was correspondence for a cousin in the Hill district. Sonara had delivered it without opening it. This, she now understood, had been the mistake, not the delivering, and the not opening. "You'll go before the Alpha King Draven at dawn," said the guard captain, in the flat tone of someone who delivered this sentence often enough that it had stopped meaning anything to him. "Espionage against the Crown carries a single sentence under the Greystone Accord. I expect you know what that is." She did. She spent the night on the stone floor of the holding cell, with her back against the cold wall, and her knees drawn up, and her eyes open, not sleeping, not weeping, thinking, which had always been the thing she was best at, and which now felt like the only tool left to her. She had 3 hours until dawn, and one story to construct, a story that was true enough to survive the scrutiny of a king's court, and incomplete enough to protect the people she had actually been working for, not Orveth, not any foreign power. The river merchants of the lower quarter, who had hired her 8 months ago, not to gather intelligence for an enemy kingdom, but to track which council lords were diverting trade tariffs into private accounts and by what mechanism. She was not a spy for anyone's crown. She was an auditor with no legal standing, a courier who had followed a pattern until it became a crime, and absolutely nowhere to go but forward. The problem was that this distinction would require proof, and her proof was in the flour barrel. She had seen Draven once, at the winter levy procession 6 months prior, when she had been cutting through the main thoroughfare on a delivery, and had paused at the corner as the royal column passed. He had not ridden with ceremony, no heralds, no distance-keeping guard formation, just the king, when in riding leathers worn at the elbows, on a grey horse that moved with the controlled ease of an animal that trusted its rider entirely. She had noticed his hands on the reins, controlled, not tense, the hands of someone who had held power long enough that it no longer needed demonstrating. She had noticed the wolf, not caged, not leashed, a pale grey creature, the size of a young stallion, running beside the horse with its head held low and its gaze moving steadily over the faces at the street's edge. Not hunting, reading. The people had gone still as it passed, the way living things go still in the presence of something operating on a different timescale. Sonara had watched until the procession was past, and then delivered her package and returned to work, and had not thought about the wolf again until now, which was not entirely true. In the lower quarter, no one named the wolf. They spoke of it through its absences, weeks without a sighting at the gates, or the nights it appeared in the high keep windows. Every courier understood without being told. It was not a pet, and not a weapon. It was the other expression of the man, the part that had no patience for court performance. She thought about this as the cell window lightened toward dawn, and she arranged what she knew and what she could prove into an order that might, if the king was what she suspected rather than what she had been told, be enough. They marched her through the keep's lower passage as the sky was turning the pale grey of old pewter. The torches in the corridors burned steadier than the ones in the courtyard, sheltered and tended. The stone floors here were clean. She filed this away alongside everything else. The great hall was larger than she had expected, and somehow still compressed, still intimate, in a way she could not account for, until she understood that what was making it feel small was the man standing at the far end of it, one hand resting on the arm of the throne he was not sitting in. Draven, Alpha King of the Greystone Accord territories. She had held the name as a legal category for 3 years. Now she stood 40 feet from the person it belonged to, and revised every assumption she had formed at a distance. He was dressed in dark wool, not ceremony, taller than she had registered from the street, broader in the shoulders, with a lateral scar on his jaw, a clean old line below his left ear, finished being a wound long ago, become a feature. His hair was black, close at the sides and longer at the crown. His eyes, finding her face across the hall, were the grey of stone after rain. Not cold exactly, but carrying the memory of it. Guards flanked the entrance, a chancellor with a scroll, 2 council members at the wall with expressions of elaborate neutrality. The wolf was absent. She looked and found the absence, felt it as a note not yet played. Sonara of the lower quarter, the Chancellor read, accused of carrying intelligence against the Crown. Evidence recovered. A sealed document bearing the Northern Garrison rotation, delivered by the accused to a contact in the Hill District on the 14th day of the last moon. That letter, Sonara said, "It was placed in my bag, without my knowledge, by Lady Orveth." The silence that fell was the particular quality of silence that told her she had said something everyone in the room had been holding at a slight distance, careful not to approach. Draven's hand on the throne did not move. His eyes did not move from her face. "You name a council lord's wife before my court," he said. His voice was low, not loud, and it moved through the hall the way sound moves through stone, without effort, finding every corner, with nothing offered as evidence. "I have a journal," Sonara said. She kept her voice level. She had been a courier for 3 years, and she had delivered difficult news before, and the trick was always the same: commit to the truth fully, before you have time to become afraid of it. 3 years of recorded deliveries, seals, routes, recipients, dates. 43 deliveries across 14 months that were commissioned specifically by Lady Orveth. Routes, timings, and a description of each recipient's response, sufficient for a competent chancellor to cross-reference them against the Eastern Trade Tariff records and find a discrepancy that has been growing since the 2nd year of Councillor Orveth's appointment. The Chancellor looked at the king. Draven looked at her. "Where is this journal?" the Chancellor asked. "Hidden," Sonara said. "It remains hidden until I receive written confirmation that the charge of espionage against the Crown is suspended pending investigation of the actual source of the letter." She was aware, at some remove, that she was standing in front of an Alpha King at dawn, having not slept, in a dress she had worn for 2 days, in making demands. She was also aware that this was the only position available to her, and she had stepped into it fully, and there was a particular kind of freedom in having no better option. It stripped away the temptation to hedge. Draven studied her for a long moment. His expression did not change in any way she could easily label, but the quality of his attention shifted, sharpened, perhaps, or deepened, and she filed that away too. "Take her to the East Tower," he said. "A room, a meal. She is not a prisoner. She is a person of interest." The East Tower room had a window that looked over the inner courtyard, and a bed with a wool blanket and a table with a single candle. Better than the cell. Better, if she was being honest, than her room in the lower quarter, where the window had no glass, and the cold came through the gap at the bottom of the door for 4 months of the year. She was given a meal twice a day. She was given access to the Keep's document room when she asked, which she asked for on the 2nd morning because doing nothing was a different kind of slow destruction, and she had always thought better with something concrete to examine. She did not see Draven. She saw evidence of him, through its residue, the way she had always studied any system. The food, arriving without her requesting specific things, but consistently avoiding the dried fish she had pushed aside on the first day. A second candle placed on her table when the first burned to a stub overnight, meaning someone had checked in the dark hours. A note in the document room, and in a hand she cross-referenced against court records, the King's Own, noting where the materials she had asked for had been moved. She spent those days doing what she did with any system she wanted to understand, looking at it until it showed her its shape. The financial records were not complete. She would not have been given the full picture, but gaps were informative. The place's ledgers had been summarized rather than itemized. The years where the notation changed. The secondary shelf organized in a way that obscured more than it revealed. On the 7th evening, she was at her window watching the last light leave the courtyard when she heard it. Not a howl. Something lower. A sound that moved through the stone of the tower walls rather than over them, as if it originated at a frequency the building itself could hear. She leaned to look into the courtyard and found the pale shape below, moving along the inner wall with its head low and its enormous shoulders rolling with each step. It was not pacing. It was the movement of an animal thinking, which was distinct from an animal in distress. She had spent enough time watching the lower city's stray dogs to understand the difference. She watched without moving. The wolf stopped. It turned its head up and looked directly at her window, not in the searching, scanning way of an animal reading a perimeter, but with the quality of having already known exactly where she was. She did not look away. It held her gaze for a moment that felt genuinely outside the normal movement of time, and then it turned and walked on, and she stayed at the window for a long time after it had gone, and aware of something having shifted that she did not yet have a word for. The next morning, a pot of ink and a blank journal appeared on her table. No note. Leather cover, tooled with a simple border, quality she could not have afforded at the market. She spent nearly an hour holding it before she opened it and began, because beginning felt significant in a way that required sitting with it first. Draven came to the document room on the 9th day. She did not hear him enter. She registered his presence first, as a shadow falling across the edge of the table where she was working, and looked up to find him standing in the doorway without announcement, in dark wool, with his sleeves pushed to the elbows, the same quality she had noticed in the great hall, and the quality of someone who dressed for work rather than for being observed performing it. He looked at what she had spread across the table. Grain import records, tariff schedules, the ledger pages she had been cross-referencing for 6 days. "You found something else?" he said. 3 years ago," she said, "a substantial quantity of winter grain was recorded as imported from the northern provinces. The tariff was paid, correctly, with the right notation. But the northern provinces had a crop failure that year. I know this because I was carrying correspondence in that district the following winter, and I remember the price of bread in the market there." She turned the ledger so he could read it. Someone paid a tariff on grain that did not exist, to explain the movement of coin that also did not exist in the way it was recorded. It is a second channel, separate from Orveth's scheme, and it is older. He looked at the ledger. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "Show me," he said. They worked until the candle burned past the point where it gave good light, and then someone, she did not see who, replaced it, and they worked further. She explained the pattern she had found in the grain records, and then, because the grain records connected to the river merchant accounts, she explained the river merchants, and because that required explaining why they had hired a courier to track council activity in the first place, she explained the whole of it, 3 years of deliveries, and what she had noticed, and why she had written it down, and what she had understood by the end of it. And he listened in the way she had come to understand was characteristic of him, fully, without interrupting, without the performing of attention that most people did when they wanted you to see that they were listening. He asked questions at intervals that told her he had been following closely, and had reached the same logical points she had. "The merchants hired you to track where their tariffs were going," he said. "Specifically, Which council accounts were receiving distributions that were not correctly apportioned? Yes. And you did this by remembering, she said, what I carried, who sent it, who received it, and in what context. Over time, the picture becomes legible, the way a river's path becomes legible if you follow it long enough. You're not a spy, he said. The candle between them had burned to a third of its length. No, she said. You are, he said slowly, as if working toward something. Something the city produced without intending to. Someone who moves through it without being noticed by it, and who, as a direct result, has noticed everything about it. She was quiet for a moment. Someone who should have opened the letter, she said. Something moved in his expression then. The warmth she had first registered in his voice, low, real, resident in a register that she suspected most people in his court never encountered, because it was not a register produced for an audience. The wolf came to your window, he said. She steadied herself carefully. I know. He does not do that. A pause. He has not done that since. He stopped, said only, a long time. She understood what it cost him to say that, not the information itself, but the act of saying it, of allowing something to be named that he had kept unnameable, perhaps because naming it made it real, and real things could be taken from you. I didn't look away from him, she said. He looked at her then, not the assessing look of the great hall, not the focused attention of the document room. Something else, the same quality as the wolf's gaze from the courtyard below, the particular directness of something that has decided. The candlelight caught the auburn of her hair where it had come loose from the braid, the way it always did when she had been working for hours, and he looked at it for a moment before he looked at her eyes, and she thought, he has not been looking past her the way the rest of the city had. He had been looking at her specifically, from the beginning. The journal, she said. I'm into the quiet. I want to retrieve it. Of course, he said, and there is a second channel in the grain records that is not yet resolved. I know, he said, and the secondary shelf system in this room was organized incorrectly, he said. I am aware. She looked at him. I had hoped, he said carefully, with something that was not quite wryness but was cousin to it, that someone would eventually come and tell me where it had gone wrong. She held that. Outside, the keep had gone to its night sounds, the distant change of the watch, the wind finding its way through the courtyard. In the document room it was warm and still, and the candle threw a light that made everything near and legible. 3 nights before the arraignment, Sonara woke to the sound of boots on the stairs, not the keep's night guard, whose rhythm she had learned, but faster, more of them, stopping outside her door. The door opened without a knock. 2 men in the grey and black of a council escort rather than the king's livery. One held a folded paper he did not offer her. Councillor Orveth requests your presence, he said. Councillor Orveth is under arraignment, Sonara said, barefoot on the cold stone. She does not have the authority to request anything from anyone in this keep. The man with the paper was large, and accustomed to size being sufficient argument. She stood up slowly, and ran the calculation. The corridor outside her room was not wide. 2 men filled it, stairs dark behind them, and she was without her cloak, and there was exactly one way out of this corridor, and it was through them. She had gone before an Alpha King at dawn with nothing in her hands before. She had nothing in her hands again. I'll come as far as the guard post at the base of the east stair, she said, where I'll ask the night guard whether the king has authorized this escort. She'll reason you to a standstill before dawn, said a voice from the far end of the corridor. Draven stood at the top of the east stair, fully dressed, the wolf at his heel with its pale eyes on the 2 men. Neither of them lingered. How did you know? She asked when they were gone. He told me, Draven said, meaning the wolf, and she filed that alongside everything else she was learning about how this system worked. She stood in the corridor a moment, barefoot on cold stone, recalibrating. "Thank you," she said. He inclined his head, turned, stopped. "The room has a second bolt. It requires a key." He held one out, iron, old, unornamented. "I had it found." She took it. "The arraignment is in 3 days." "I know," he said, "and the grain records still have an open channel. I'll have the preliminary traced by morning." He looked at her once more, directly, without performance, and then he was gone, and she locked both bolts and opened the ledger and worked until the sky went grey. Lady Orveth's arraignment, before the full court, came on the 12th day. Sinara stood at the side of the great hall and watched the woman enter. Orveth had composed herself carefully. She wore her best gown, her chin was level, her expression rehearsed for exactly the posture of someone wrongly accused and confident in her vindication, as she had clearly calculated that the girl from the lower quarter would not have proof enough to hold. She looked at Sinara once, as the charges were being read, and the composition faltered. The journal was presented. The cross-referenced tariff records were presented. 3 of the river merchants had come forward once assured of the king's protection, and their testimony was presented. The full 14 months of correspondence, route by route, seal by seal, were laid before the court. "You were nothing," Orveth said, when the weight of it had settled into the air of the hall, and the council members at the wall had gone very still. She looked at Sinara directly, not at the king, not at her own advocates, at Sinara, with the specific anger of someone who had been defeated by something they had dismissed. A courier, was a ghost in the lower quarter, who carried other people's messages and did not even have the sense to read them. "I didn't read them," Sinara said. "I remembered them." Draven delivered the judgment without ceremony. He stood beside the throne rather than in it, as he had at the beginning of all this, and his voice moved through the hall without effort. The sentence was not death. It was removal, from the council, from the title, from the city. A stripping calibrated with precision. Orveth lost the position her cruelty had been built into, the platform from which she had exercised it, the audience before whom she had performed it. She was left intact and without recourse, which was, Sinara thought, more disquieting than a simpler ending would have been. When the hall had emptied, the council members departing with the particular speed of people who needed to recalibrate their positions privately, Sinara remained at the wall, working out what came next. The lower quarter, the flour barrel, the small house and the roots she knew, and the life she had been sustaining, carefully, for 7 years. Draven came to stand beside her, not in front of her, not at any formal distance, beside. "There is a position," he said. She had thought, since the document room, about what he might say. She had not been able to decide whether to be afraid of it or not. "You are describing work," she said, "not a title." "The work has no title," he said. "It has not existed in organized form before. Someone who tracks the movement of information through the kingdom's structures, who reads patterns in financial records and correspondence and the gaps between them, who can identify when something is not where it should be and understand why." "Someone the city does not notice," she said, "until they already understand it." "Someone," he said, "who is not a spy." "No," she said, "not for any of the kingdoms you were afraid of." "No," he said, and then quietly, "for mine, if you're willing." The wolf appeared at the far entrance to the hall. She did not see it enter. It was simply there at the threshold, the way it seemed to be simply anywhere, all at once, without transition. It moved down the length of the hall without hurrying. Its pale head held level, and stopped beside Draven, and pressed its shoulder against his hand. His hand settled on it. Not a command, a recognition. The wolf turned its great head and looked at Sinara. She looked back. "The document room," she said. "The secondary shelf, needs to be restructured from the foundation. The current system obscures more than it organizes. I'll arrange access, he said. And the grain record channel is not closed. There's a second party still unidentified. I know, he said. I've been waiting to find someone who could follow it. She was quiet in the hall, in the grey morning light that came through the high windows and made everything honest and specific. The banners hanging still in the cold air, the wolf warm and solid and present at their side. I'll start today, she said. He did not smile, but something shifted in him, the particular quality of someone who has been braced against a thing for a long time and has just set it down. She felt it the way she had felt the wolf's gaze from the window, directly, and without pretending she had not. She retrieved her journal from the flour barrel that afternoon, carried it back through the lower quarter streets with the cold river smell in the air, climbed the steps of the Greystone Keep a second time, this time without guards. She sat at the desk in the document room, opened the blank journal Draven had left her, picked up the pen. The secondary shelf needed restructuring from the foundation. The grain records needed a second full pass. The Eastern tariff pattern had at least one branch still untraced. There was enough work here to last years. Years of moving through the kingdom system with her quality of stillness, finding the things everyone else had walked past. She had not been sent here as anyone's spy. She had arrived as herself, a woman from the lower quarter who remembered everything, who had been called nothing so many times she had learned to make the nothing useful, who had kept records not because anyone asked her to, but because the world was a system and she wanted to understand it. Outside, the city was beginning its morning. The wolf settled beside her on the stone floor without announcement, its great head on its paws, pale eyes closing slowly. And Sonara opened the ledger to the page she had marked, dipped the pen, and began.